Hey there, it's Colleen and welcome back to my sewing channel. So today is a great day because I showered, got dressed, did hair and makeup, and I have time to sew, which doesn't happen very often, and that's part of the reason why we have been delayed on having a new video on this channel. Life gets busy sometimes, and my real day job got really hectic for a bit, and so I've been working a lot during the day, and then when I do have time to sew, I've tended to be sewing for 15, 20, 30 minutes here or there, and usually I look like a swamp hag. Because if you haven't gained 20 pounds during the pandemic and spent 5 out of every 7 days looking disgusting, are you actually living your best life? Or is that just me? Maybe it's just me. But anyway, I am embarking on 18th century fashion. This is the first time I've done anything like this for 18th century, which means I need to start from the skin out. I need a shift, I need stays, I need all the support garments, I need petticoats, I need the dress, the skirt, whatever it is that I'm gonna make, the hat, all the accessories, I need everything. So you just gotta start at the beginning, and that's why I'm choosing this pattern. So this is the 18th century pattern from American Duchess. They have two patterns, 8161 and 8162. This is the one that has all of the undergarments, and this is where I'm starting. Today I want to talk about making the chemise in the interest of being practical, being cheap, being pragmatic, being thrifty, eco-conscious. I'm not sure what the right label is, but I'm using an old linen tablecloth that I had. It had a stain in a corner and I couldn't get the stain out, so it's no longer useful for a tablecloth. So I put it into my sewing stash, and that is what I'm going to use to make the chemise. Now I've already started this project, so this is leftover fabric, and you can see it's just a really nice natural linen. It's been washed and dried several times, so I don't have to worry about shrinkage. So I'm actually looking to make this more sort of Outlander or Highlander look that's shown on this other pattern envelope. I'm gonna probably land somewhere in here. So in my opinion, a coarser linen chemise is probably just fine. You know, if you're a working class or a poor person, you wouldn't have had access to fine linen, so it makes sense to have something a little more coarse, something unbleached, something that you wouldn't have to worry so much about. So anyway, that's the plan. And like I said, I'm about 3/4 of the way through the project. So what I'm doing is I'm making it historically accurate or historically adequate. I'm going to go ahead and sew the seams that won't show on my sewing machine, and anything that will show, I'm doing by hand. That's going to be a little time consuming. The linen does fray quite a bit, so you have to finish the seams, and the pattern doesn't call for any seam finishing at all. It'd be really quick and easy to just run that through my serger or to sew a French seam on the machine, but I'm actually felling down all of those stitches by hand, and I'll show you that process here. I love the look, and it actually makes me really happy. Those little tiny stitches don't take too terribly long, but they look so nice, and it makes me really happy to see that. I also left off the ruffle on the chemise, so I'll talk about that a little bit in the video as well. I feel like this ruffle makes this piece less versatile. I would rather have a ruffle on the dress itself, or something that I can take off or put on, maybe baste in a ruffle instead, and that gives me a little more flexibility for how I use that garment in the future. So I'm leaving the ruffle off the neckline, but I love the ruffles at the sleeve, so I'm gonna have those for sure. And we will see where we end on this. Anyway, thanks for joining me, and let's take a look at this project. I am going to make the shift first, then I will make the bum pad, and then I will make the stays. I'm a little intimidated by the stays, but also I don't have everything I need for them. I had to order some zip ties and some twill tape, and those should be here in a few days. For the fabric for the shift, I'm going to use this linen tablecloth, and it's not white, but I don't care. Nobody's going to see it but me. And I think that the colors I'm going to use for my costume go well with this as an undergarment too. So if, for example, the edges of the sleeves stick out, I'm not going to be upset that they're this natural linen color. I have a very long dining room table when all the leaves are in, so I bought this to go with that. This should be more than enough material to cut out a shift, and so that's what I'm going to start with. I just double checked my cutting layout, so I definitely have enough fabric, and I don't have to do anything weird. So I'm going to go ahead and start cutting size 20, and we will hope for the best. Remember that sizing is just arbitrary on these sewing patterns. So it says size 20 based on my measurements, but my street size is 12 to 14. So don't get hung up on the number. The other thing is that a lot of commercial patterns don't include the finished garment measurements, so you kind of have to do a little bit of guesswork. I probably could have cut one size smaller. I'm having to piece one of the sleeve ruffles, and I thought I'd go ahead and use this. This is thread that I bought at Aldi for about $4, and it has a lot of different colors in it. This color is the closest to my linen, and I thought, you know, for $4, I'll just see if it works. If nothing else, it will make good embroidery floss if I need something in a pinch, right? So I just tried sewing with it in my machine for the first time, and the thread is breaking. And let me just show you, this is just right off the spool, snaps. So this is really crappy thread. I can just pull it with my hand, so it's not able to hold up to the tension of my sewing machine. If it snaps, it means it's old, it's rotten, or it's just poorly made thread. I did not have high hopes for this box of thread for that kind of price. I knew that that it was a pretty big risk. I usually use Gooderman or Coats & Clark, but mostly Gooderman thread for my machine. And I have really good luck with it as like an all-purpose thread. But, you know, I don't want to buy a whole thing of lime green thread or neon orange thread if I just need to sew on a button or something. So basically, I got this for crafting. But since I just tried it in my machine, I thought I would give you the report. This is not for machine sewing, it's weak, so I labeled the whole outside of the container. Cheap thread is not a good deal. Okay, I have cut out all my pieces. I have stay stitched the front and the back, and I'm going to attach them together here. So I am skipping the neck ruffle. So what I'll end up doing is sewing this on and then sewing on the casing for the drawstring. My drawstring won't be here for a few days. I think I can go ahead and do some finishing on the sleeve ruffles and get the sleeves prepared while I wait for the drawstring, but that's plenty wide. That's plenty wide. So I'm not going to have any issues with fit on this, I don't think. Hopefully it won't be too big in the shoulders. So I decided to do this historical-ish. So this is going to be the first time I ever do a felled seam, which, if I understand correctly, let's see. We're going to press the seam I just made. We're going to trim down the seam allowance on the one side, like this. And see, I'm just going to totally experiment here because I live on the wild side. We're going to open this up, and we're going to fold this extra seam allowance over the raw edge and then stitch it down by hand right along here using a felling stitch. It makes a nice, neat seam. Now I could have done this as a French seam, but I don't want the bulk, and I think I'd like the appearance of a felled seam. I finally bought some beeswax. I've not used this before, but I hear it's good for hand stitching. Now I'm just using regular sewing thread, like an all-purpose thread from Gooderman. I don't have any fancy linen thread or anything like that. Eventually, maybe I'll get some of those things, but right now I don't have that. And I am going to double my thread because this is rather thin. I'm going to use my sewing bird to help with this. We're going to hold it, let's see, I think I'll hold it this way. Right on the end there, but out of the way of the stitch itself. The felling stitch is actually really easy. You come up through the fold, and then you take a stitch directly opposite using just a few threads. Travel your needle under the fold and repeat over and over and over again for miles of seams on this project. But it's actually really fun, and it didn't take that long. I also really love how all those neat little stitches look. So there you have, it's nice and neat on the wrong side with all the raw edges enclosed, and from the right side it's also nice and neat and you don't see any machine stitching. I've got the main sleeve and I have the sleeve gusset. So I'm going to take one piece This is the top edge. So I want to make sure I keep that straight. And I have my sleeve gussets. So the pattern says to stitch these on between the dots. So I am going to go ahead and pin on both sleeves in the same way. All right, I'll take these over to the machine and stitch between the dots on all 4 gussets. Okay, so next on the sleeve gusset, the instruction says on the inside, which is the inside of the garment once it's sewn, so that would be on this side, I am to cut the seam allowance by the dot. So, but it has to be on this bigger piece. So I'm gonna cut that right in line with the dot, up to but not through the seam. And then this should go on the other side. And yeah, that's how it's supposed to go, on iron flat. So I've been debating on when to do the sleeve ruffle. It has you attach it now while it's flat, and then you sew it up and then do a narrow hem on the lower edge of the ruffle. I was debating about maybe I should do like complete the ruffle and then stitch it into the sleeve after the sleeve is made. I think I'm going to go ahead and just follow the instructions and hope for the best. So I have done my 2 rows of machine stitching along the edge to be gathered. That's a lot of ruffle. I was debating on even putting it on because I'm skipping the neck ruffle, and I wondered if I would have more versatility with this garment if I left it off. The answer is yes, I probably would. However, I like the way it looks peeking out of the jacket on this costume, and I think it'll be okay. Here you'll see I'm using a pin to stroke the gathers. This just means I'm using the very tip of a straight pin to evenly distribute the fabric along that ruffle. So I have my 2 lines of basting stitches, and I have gathered up the fabric to fit the straight edge. So now I'm just arranging the fabric in the pleat so that they lay nice and flat before I sew them. So here's what the sleeve ruffles look like once they're sewn on. They look nice, but there are no instructions on the pattern for finishing that seam. So you can see it's a raw edge and it just doesn't look great. So what I did was cut like a bias strip of the linen and just stitched it around that seam allowance. So this one looks nice and neat, and this one looks messy. So that'll help keep it from fraying, and it'll make it look nice when you're wearing it. I kind of wish I had put this to the outside because I think it looks really cool, but that'll be on the inside. So now if my sleeve happens to show in any way as I'm doing stuff, you'll see just a nice neat finish in there. You can see I have stitched that bias strip on there, and now I'm going to trim off the excess seam allowance. Go around the edge, press it down flat, and fell it into place. I managed off camera to finish off the neckline of the chemise. So I sewed on a strip of bias facing, turned it, and then sewed it down by hand because I didn't want to have visible stitching on the outside. And I was waiting for twill tape to come in, but voila, here it is. So it did show up, and this will be the drawstring for this gigantic neck hole. So I'm hopeful that I will be okay with the size that I ended up cutting. It's really, really big, but I know that'll give it the fullness around the neck that we need. So anyway, that I have to put in. I've got the sleeves now to attach. They're ready to put on. It doesn't have you hem them until the very end, but one thing I do like is it has you attach the sleeves while the garment is still open. So I haven't sewed up the side seams yet. It's a lot easier to stitch in the sleeves this way while it's flat. Anything you can do while the garment is flat is better than doing it while it's a big tube or all sewn together or whatever. So now it's time to pin the side seams and the rest of the arm seam. And the only tricky part here is that you have to make sure that where you clipped those gusset and side seams to get them to lay on the inside, You have to make sure that those are still positioned that way when you go to sew, or else it won't turn out right. So I'm just double checking my placement there. Notice that I'm taking my time when I'm stitching around those corners to make sure that all of the seams are laying exactly as they ought to. That's especially tricky on the corner of those gussets. But when you come to a corner, just leave your needle in the fabric, lift your presser foot, pivot, and sew. That looks about right. So historically, the seam would not be here. It would have been just a square set in on the diagonal without the seam. But I think this works for what it is. No one will even see it.
Skip to the end.
I have felled down the long side seam all the way to the hem, and I felled down all of these little seams in the underarm gusset area, which didn't take too terribly long. It's a little complicated though, because there's a lot of them and there's a lot of intersections. Anyway, so now that leaves me with the sleeve, and I was worried if I did a felled seam like this, that it would be hard to make a narrow seam at the cuff of the ruffle. Now that I've played with it a little bit, I think a felled seam will be fine. And the added benefit is that it will cover this little hunk that's left here. So that's kind of the issue with all of these intersecting seam lines and the way that the modern pattern has you put it together. If I had made this in a truly historical fashion, this would have been one piece without a seam down the middle. And then from the videos I've seen, the way it's stitched down, it's just a lot easier to finish off those seams along the way. So 1 point to historical sewing and 1 point away from simplicity. Now all that's left to do is the hem and the sleeve ruffle hem. I'm guessing I'm going to fold it over maybe 1/8 of an inch and then another 1/8 of an inch and stitch that down by hand. Because I've come this far, I'm not going to do it by machine. It would be really tempting to run that through the machine. And then finally, I'll do the hem, which is 1.25 inches total allowance. So turn it up 1/4 inch and then turn it 1 inch and then stitch that down by hand. And that will be the end of the chemise. So that's it. That's the first step on my journey to having a complete 18th century costume. So again, this is the chemise from Simplicity 8162. And from what I understand from watching the videos by American Duchess, who designed the pattern, this would be appropriate for the latter half of the 1700s, so 1750s to 1790s. And this is the first step. So you have to have a shift or a chemise to put underneath your stays. What did I like and what did I not like about this pattern? Well, so the fit is what it is, right? I mean, it seems to be fine once you pull up the drawstring. It's extremely baggy. I might have been able to go down a size and still had plenty of room for everything underneath the chemise. The ruffles on the sleeves are probably my favorite thing. You know, I think it was easy to construct. Where I made it difficult was doing all of the hand sewing. If I were to make this completely on the machine using a serger and just running through it from start to finish, it probably wouldn't take more than a couple of hours. Of course, I did hand finish all of the seams, and that takes extra time. I'm happy that I did it. I've seen a lot of videos with people doing the hand sewing, and that lends a more historically accurate finish to your items. I always thought, oh gosh, that would take forever. And actually, it really didn't take that long. You just stick on your YouTube videos, you watch along, you stitch along, and before you know it, you've finished. So I would do that again for sure, and I will do that on the other historical costumes that I'm making moving forward. Anything that won't show, I'll do on a machine. Anything that will show, I'll try to do by hand. This pattern allowed for a 1.25 inch hem. But once I cut it out, I don't know if it was the linen stretching as I cut or if it was just an inaccuracy in the pattern. The hem was completely wonky. Now I have this handy little gadget here that you're supposed to be able to put on the floor, put the chalk line at the height that you want, and then you're supposed to be able to measure the hem yourself. This thing snapped off, and then I couldn't get the chalk to come out. So there's lots of chalk in here, but it wouldn't come out. I've had this for several years. I don't use it very often, probably because it's not that effective. So what I ended up doing was just evening it out the best I can, which means it's shorter in the front than it is in the back. And I think it's actually shorter. I thought for a second maybe it was because, you know, I have
A bosom.
and the bosom takes up some of the length. So I thought maybe that's why it was shorter in the front, but it's actually just that way. So I don't know if that was intentional or not. It does not look like that on the pattern envelope. I think this will be fine. This is a more of a coarse linen. It's not a fine linen. It is a little bit heavier, and about maybe 3/4 of the way through the project, I was like, I probably should have used a lighter weight linen and left this for a petticoat. But I'm using what I have in my stash, and if you haven't already seen my video where I got rid of literally half of my fabric, make sure you watch that. I'll link to that here. But one of my goals was to sew my way through my stash. So I'm using what I had on hand. And if I do a finer, like a higher class outfit, something a little dressier with better fabrics, I will certainly make a new chemise. I mean, I won't use this coarse linen one under a fancy gown. But for workday clothes, working woman, middle class, it's perfectly fine. So anyway, I'm excited to move on from here. And in the end, like I said, I was really happy with the process. I was happy with the fit. There are some things that are not historically accurate about the way Simplicity interpreted American Duchess's pattern, but you know, it is what it is. It'll be fine. So thanks for joining me today. If you haven't already, follow me on Instagram. My handle is @crmarble. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell if you like what you see here. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments down below. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time.